So for those of you in the second row who don't know me, I'm Barbara Mennel. I'm the Rothman Chair and the Director of the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere at UF. And I was asked by Will Hasty, who's organizing the door, who organized this panel, to thank the sponsors on behalf of Songs. And this event was made possible by the funding and support of the Waldo W. Nyquist Professorship Fund, the UF International Center, the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Culture, the Center for Medieval and Early Modern Studies, and the Imagining Climate Change Initiative. And my other role here today is to introduce Simon Richter. So it's my great pleasure to tell you a little bit more about Simon Richter, who's a scholar whose research has been on the forefront of German studies, from queer theory to questions of sustainability. His institutional commitments, as well as published research in articles, books, and edited volumes, not only reflect the broad range of his scholarly interests, but also demonstrates how a discipline such as German studies, which is one of the canaries in the coal mine of the American academic landscape, remains pertinent to scholarly and public interdisciplinary debates. He's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania with affiliations across cinema studies, women's studies, urban studies, and the environmental humanities. And he's also the director of Penn in Berlin and Rotterdam, summer study abroad program, which demonstrates his dedication to students. His research has been widely supported by the Humboldt Foundation, the American Council of Learned Society, and the German Academic Exchange Service. He has several sole-authored and co-edited volumes that offer innovative perspectives on German classicism and make those canonical authors productive for contemporary inquiry while bringing new methodologies to bear on familiar texts. His latest book, Women, Pleasure, Film, What Lolas Want, is a tour de force of a cinematic trope, which, typical for his methodology, reaches outward from the specificity of German film to transnational permutations of the theme and across time from the 1920s to the contemporary moment. He is currently working on 3 books, ranging from classical German literature to the Dutch response to rising seas and sinking cities, and that's only one indicator of his awe-inspiring scope of his scholarship. And so we will learn more about this current project in his talk today, so please help me welcome Simon Richter.
I don't need it. Thank you, Barbara, for a very warm welcome. That was lovely. And I really want to thank the experts who will be introduced later. And thank you for being here. And I'm very much looking forward to your response. When you look at the title that I put up there, you know, what comes after the colon, I think, probably looks very familiar to the sorts of titles that you're accustomed to. But you might be wondering about that Polder-Geist at the beginning. That's the playful humanities part that comes into the picture. I'll clarify that in a moment. I want to say at the outset that I'm not going to answer the question, can the Dutch save us? That's a question that gets asked a lot, of course, and with a lot of urgency as well, especially in coastal areas. I'm not qualified to answer that question. But I would say, if you do live in a coastal region, you know, it would make sense to consult the Dutch. They certainly have a lot to say, a lot of interesting ideas, and it would be rather foolish, I think, not to consult them. I just am not going to answer that question today. I'm going to approach this in a little bit of a different way so that you will hear something that seems familiar but adds something that maybe you haven't taken into consideration before. This image that you're looking at, I want to mention that just briefly, is from Semarang, which is a coastal city in Indonesia that is subsiding at a rate that is similar to that of Jakarta. It's taken in a polder. It's the Bunger polder, which is a brand new polder. It's only been in existence for a couple of years or so. And I want to call your attention to what it says on the t-shirt that you're looking at. You see dry feet for all. And then the same phrase in Bahasa Indonesia, kaki kering untuk semua. But not sounding, but behind it is, of course, a Dutch phrase, and a very, very powerful Dutch phrase, droge voeten, dry feet. That is the sort of clarion phrase for polders and the work that the Rijkswaterstaat, the Water Ministry, and the waterschappen, the district water boards, what they do to keep feet dry in the Netherlands. All right, we need a working definition of what a polder is because some of you may not know. And this one is as good as any. What's bolded is what I'm really going to call attention to. Polders are a special type of drained agricultural land. That's how it starts. And it starts, 17th century, earlier than that in the Netherlands. And usually it is for agricultural purposes. But cities, of course, over the course of centuries grow. And so many polders are urban. And that Bunger polder I showed you, that's also an urban polder. So that's why I wanted to put that in brackets. Typically found in low-lying coastal areas, river plains, shallow lakes, lagoons, upland depressions. Before impoldering, these areas were either waterlogged or temporarily or permanently underwater. That means they're at very low elevations, often lower than the sea, or through subsidence they get there. They are lower than the sea. This is the important part. An area becomes a polder when it is separated from the surrounding hydrological regime in such a way that its water level, can be controlled independently of its surrounding regime, right? So it becomes a sort of a watershed in its own right. Right? It's self-contained. It involves a system of dikes, canals, often a pump, which keeps on draining the water or drains the water when necessary, when the water reaches a level that is too high, and thus we have dry feet. Okay, now you're wondering about Polder-Geist. Where does that come into the picture? You probably recognize the word Polter-Geist, a German word, right? And this is the Polder-Geist. Now, I'm thinking of Polder-Geist in two ways. One as a sort of a mindset, a mentality, because Geist, that German word, means that as well. So it's a sort of polder mindset. And because the Netherlands, and a good part of the Netherlands, and a lot of the important and populated cities in the Netherlands are below sea level, there is a Polder-Geist, right, in the Netherlands. It's a way of thinking, of perceiving the world, of understanding your place in the world. And there's also a little bit back there as well. I think at the University of Florida, I'm sure you have team spirit, right? And that makes sense here too. There is a kind of spirit that projects and that is interested in getting people enthusiastic about this technology, about this know-how, and so on. A promotional sort of spirit. That's involved in Polder-Geist as well. But there's also a Geist, a ghost, who is haunting the polder. Because if you think about it, polders are triumphant accomplishments. Amazing when you think about it. Polders that have been in existence for centuries, still in existence, and that by this time, the protective system that's in place, the Delta Works in the Netherlands, it keeps millions of people alive, living at elevations below sea level. All right? So that's an amazing accomplishment. But at the same time, frankly, it's a mistake. Right? Retrospectively, you look back and you say, we shouldn't be living here. This doesn't really make sense. But you're committed with so many assets, with so many people, that it becomes difficult, of course, to consider abandoning that land that you've occupied and invested so much in over such a long time. And there's a Geist, a ghost there that haunts the polder and doesn't often show itself, but I'm going to try to sort of summon it forth so that we can confront that Geist, that ghost here. All right. So one way of thinking what I'm doing is I'm going to take the Dutch approach to water management, and I'm going to invite it to lie down on the couch. And we're going to talk, and we'll talk about the accomplishments of the Dutch approach, the goals of the Dutch approach, its ways of doing things and so on. And in the process, I think something will emerge. And then we're going to talk about that. All right? Okay. I'm going to start with a series of thesis statements. I'll illustrate them, I'll talk about them briefly, and we'll move along at a pretty good clip. As everybody knows, the Dutch are masters of water management. I don't have to say any more. But I will I could defer to so many people. I'm going to defer here to the Minister of Public Works and Housing in Indonesia, so federal government. And he says in a document that is a joint document of the Netherlands and Indonesia through their MOU, their water partnership, the Netherlands has a strong international reputation in the area of water management. Much of the Netherlands is reclaimed land, and they have centuries of experience protecting themselves against encroaching rivers and seas. And so many people have said that, and the Dutch want lots of people to say that, right? They say it themselves, and they hear it often, and they're pleased when they hear it. Part of their water prowess depends on the amazing precision of a built environment where the levels of water tables are managed to the centimeter. I'm going to illustrate that for you. How many of you have seen this before in the Netherlands? This is called NAP, or Normaal Amsterdam's Peil, or just Peil. And what it is it is a measurement system, that a standard that is used throughout the country to determine where the water table is relative to Amsterdam, to a certain point in Amsterdam. This was established many years ago, and that's just their standard point of reference. Right? So whenever you see that, you can know. NAP, as I'll explain in a moment, let me explain it in a moment. Let me show you another one of these. This is kind of striking. This is NAP at a point, you can see it, that is 6.74 meters below NAP. NAP is more or less sea level. So this is a point, doesn't look it, but this is a point that's around 20 feet or so below sea level. And you have one of these standards. It's not really there for, let's say, administrative use, but rather to show off, I think, in a certain sense. Okay, so we could go to the website of the NAP, and we would see there that, that they say that NAP is the equivalent of sea level, more or less. And here we see droge voeten houden, to keep feet dry, right? That's a part of what NAP helps the Netherlands, the Rijkswaterstaat, and the waterschappen do. This is a slide from one of these waterschappen, one of the district water authorities. And what I want to call your attention to here is in that short middle paragraph, where you will see that it says, because of the different ways the land is used, the area, and this is a waterschap that includes Rotterdam, the area maintains 184 fixed water levels, as the water level has a direct influence on the use of the land. So we're back to NAP, to the precision here. In this area, which is not all that big, 184 different fixed water levels are maintained. That's part of the job, but a very important job of the district water authority, right? That means there's water moving through all the time. And so it's constantly being pumped up and out. And so these levels have to be maintained. They have to be maintained in the sense of not only too high, but also not too low. Too low is bad for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that dikes weaken when they dry out. All right. Oh goodness, that's a blank slide, but one more final slide with regard to that centimeter precision before I show you a few other things. Here, this is a dynamic or interactive map. You can actually pinpoint on a place and you will read there, vast peil minus 6.45. So at that place, that is the fixed level that is maintained by the waterschap. Now precision matters not just on this sort of micro level, but also on this very large infrastructural level. This is the Eastern Scheldt storm surge barrier. It is a phenomenal barrier. It is open normally and closes only when storms bring much significantly higher water. But it also requires amazing precision. When this was created, a wonder that it was finished in the mid-'80s. The window, because of the intertidal movement, to actually unfold, let's say, the mat or the mattress upon which these gates then close down, was 30 minutes. That's all that they had to work with. And so under those incredibly stressful, turbulent conditions, they managed to install this storm surge barrier with amazing precision. Now, that was a change from the previous dam that they built, which was also a phenomenon, the Afsluitdijk, which which closed off the Zuiderzee, the Zuiderzee as we call it, and created a new fresh body of water, the IJsselmeer. This used to be the Zuiderzee on this side, and now it is a body of fresh water. It maintains different water levels, of course, and it had rather devastating environmental consequences, but it did protect them, and so it was seen as an amazing accomplishment. 1932, if I'm not mistaken, is when that's completed, so shortly before Hitler and the Nazis take power in Germany. Another that you might be familiar with is the Maasland storm surge barrier. This is even more recent. These are robotic arms that float across when necessary, then fill with water, then sink, stop at a point where you have this much space so that the velocity of the water can clear the sill, and then they drop again. And I mean, they're a sight to behold. Each one of these is as long as the Eiffel Tower. It's an amazing sight. It keeps the canal to Rotterdam open, and that is, of course, for ship traffic, considering how important the Rotterdam harbor is, very important. Another instance of precision, this is one of the most recent projects, Room for the River, happened all along the major rivers. This one in Nijmegen, and what happened here is that a river, the River Waal, which comes out of Germany and then did this elbow through the city of Nijmegen. It had flooded badly twice in the mid-'90s, and initially the idea was we've got to erect higher dikes, but that would have cut the city off entirely from the river, which would not have been beneficial. And so they decided, we'll lower the dikes, we will increase capacity of the river, but we'll move the dikes back, we'll give land back to the river, and not only that, I'm going to step out of the picture here for a minute. All of this was land. So the river edge used to be like this, and this was settled. And so they actually managed to persuade people to move their homes and their businesses from that area without a single lawsuit, with everybody essentially satisfied and okay with the fact that they needed to move. This has raised quality of life in the city of Nijmegen. The citizens love this area. It's become a favorite recreational area. It is a phenomenal thing to see. Precision, it can hold massive volume of water when there is heavy rain in Europe, and it all drains towards the Netherlands, right? And I've seen it. So bridges, one of those bridges, a pedestrian bridge, submerges, it goes underwater. Water creeps up all the way up here. That island, much of it goes underwater, etc. It's an amazing thing to see, but it's very, very precise. Okay, so the Dutch are masters of myth making and brand creation, and they're very, very good at it, sometimes. Not always, sometimes. Let me show you a few really good ones. Ruimte voor de rivier, Room for the River, you saw that, that's a great one. Rebuild by Design, that was in the New York City area after Hurricane Sandy, and the Dutch are behind that, especially Henk Ovink. And that's, of course, a very effective logo, which we could analyze, but we won't for time reasons. Building with nature is another one that is circulating around the world and that one now associates with the Dutch. This one is brand new, water as leverage. And that one is a version of Rebuild by Design in 3 Asian cities, in Bangladesh, in India, and in Semarang in Indonesia. But sometimes it doesn't always work too well. This one, this was a Tour de France, I think, and at that point, one of the legs ended at that storm surge barrier, the Eastern Scheldt storm surge barrier, and they thought, what a great time to advertise. And they put up there, what are you thinking? What are you thinking? Bring in the Dutch, right? Yeah, I don't think that's a successful pun, but it was a good idea. All right. The Dutch want the world to think of them as water superheroes, and much of the world does. So in the New York Times, time and time again, you will see articles along these lines. This is Rotterdam that we're looking at. The Dutch have solutions to rising seas. The world is watching. And this, closer to home, this was an interview with outgoing General Consul of the Netherlands to Miami, Nathalie Olieslager, and you see that she is represented here as a water Wonder Woman, right? She's got her cape, she's got her hands, her arms akimbo, and even Neptune is a big fan of this girl, as it says there, right? So it's clear that that message of being a water superhero was getting across, was getting out there. In the United States, every water-related disaster is free advertising for the Dutch. I'll let these headlines speak for themselves. You've seen them yourself, I'm sure, and every time there's a hurricane and flooding, you see these headlines and hear it on the TV. The Dutch have achieved a remarkable degree of market penetration in the United States and internationally. This gentleman here, whom I know and respect greatly, is Henk Ovink. He is the special envoy for the Kingdom of the Netherlands for international water affairs. He's a passionate, driven man, driven by a sense of urgency. He knows a great deal. He is, in some sense, I would say, the embodiment of the Dutch approach. He brings with him, everywhere he goes, the message of the Dutch approach, which is problems can be opportunities. We can bring problems together and come up with novel opportunities that are life-changing for a city, for instance. I sometimes think of him as a water whisperer. He's a remarkable man. So that's an indication. You'll see here it says that President Obama asked him to lead a task force. And the result was Rebuild by Design. He worked with Sean Donovan and Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. So think of that. Someone from the Netherlands is actually asked by the president to lead this initiative after Sandy. He did it again in San Francisco with Resilient by Design, and he's doing the same kind of thing all over the world. This is Hurricane Sandy. In the U.S., we also had, out of the Washington, D.C. Embassy, the Dutch dialogues in Virginia, in New Orleans, and a few other places. Further abroad, in Ho Chi Minh City, that is the Climate Adaptation Strategy, which is a joint product of the Netherlands and Vietnam. The Delta Plan for Bangladesh, you can hear it, Delta Plan, that's what the Dutch call these things. That's also a joint product. The Mekong Delta Plan in Vietnam, the Vietnam Climate Adaptation Partnership. You can go around the world and you will find them. I already mentioned Water as Leverage, this newest one. Okay, but people are occasionally ambivalent about the Dutch approach. When you first hear about it, you're very excited, usually. But as you sort of research further, look into it further, doesn't mean that you become ambivalent necessarily, but you do encounter some voices that are critical. And I'm going to bring two of them into the picture here. One is Ashley Dawson. Ashley wrote a book called Extreme Cities. which has some very fine chapters, I think, on New York, which he knows really, really well. But he also has sections on the Netherlands and on Jakarta. And there, I'm less convinced. He's not been in a long time to the Netherlands, and he never was in Jakarta. Anyway, you read there something along the lines of, in tandem with the penetration of saltwater, corrosive neoliberal ideologies have also made inroads into Dutch systems of governance. It's a critique of the approach along political lines within the context of a neoliberal critique. I would say that, let's see, where are my notes there? I had notes here. Oh well. I'll say, I should mention, excuse me, I got ahead of myself again. There we go. Yes, what one often hears is the approach of the Dutch is too expensive. There are aspects of it that are quite expensive and probably too expensive for the global south. Not necessarily, but perhaps there may be ways. The Dutch idea is, any challenge, and also that challenge, is one that we want to grapple with. But some is not necessarily expensive. That Bunger-Polder is a joint product of the Dutch and the city of Semarang. Actually, that district water board in Rotterdam and the city of Semarang. In developed countries, I think it's a matter of priorities. If you set priorities that involve water protection, prevention of disaster, then you can probably make things happen. If that isn't your priority, you won't. Prevention, as the Dutch say, is expensive, but it's cheaper than rebuilding. That is often true. They also say the Netherlands is homogeneous. If you've been to the Netherlands, you know that that's not true. It's not homogeneous by any means. The Netherlands is so small. Yeah, it is. But we don't always think nationally or federally in the United States. We tend to think regionally. And so we can break it down that way as well. This is from a colleague of mine at the University of Pennsylvania. The Dutch can't save us, so he is willing to go out there and say they can't save us from rising seas. My sense is there that he basically reduces Dutch solutions to hard infrastructure, gray infrastructure, and isn't sort of willing or doesn't recognize the sorts of other options that they have. Okay, so I'm a little defensive on this point for the sake of debate. Let's be clear, though. The Dutch do have an international water ambition. That's their own terms, and I'll show it to you. Here's an official document from the Netherlands, Internationale Waterambitie. And if you take a look at that city, you'll say, is that Rotterdam? Is that Rotterdam? What city is that? Say it loud. It's New York. Right, it's New York. International water ambition. And do you recognize that yellow-green line that goes around there? It has a name. It's called the Big U. It is actually one of the products of the Rebuild by Design initiative. And so that is indicative, apparently, of the sort of scope of the international water ambition, to be in places like New York and to accomplish things like that. There is Dutch involvement there, but it's not exclusively Dutch. I believe the Danes are the major architectural firm involved in the Big U. Okay, let's see. Oh yeah, here, this is from the International Water Ambition. These are the main points: shift from rebuilding to preventing, improve water governance, increase the role of water diplomacy, improve the situation of vulnerable groups, also in developing countries. Good stuff. That's genuine stuff. Increase the profitability of the Dutch water sector. It's spelled out. And I don't think one can blame them, but we need to recognize it is a part of the Dutch approach, and a very, very important part of it. The Dutch have a lot at stake here. In Indonesia, the Dutch are involved in many, many projects. 91 are listed there. But if you look at the project funding, you'll see that some 34%, a third of the funding, comes from the Netherlands. So actually monetizing their know-how is proving slightly more difficult than maybe one would think, right? So that's a bit of an issue. Okay. Could there be a second golden age of the Netherlands? every once in a while this flickers around. You remember the Golden Age. This was the time of Rembrandt and Vermeer, the flourishing of these cities, the Dutch burgers, the sort of rising Dutch middle class and so on. You know, it depended on trade from the Spice Islands, from Indonesia and so on. There were other forms of trade that the Dutch were involved in, the slave trade, for instance, right? So it flourished, and it flourished because of its extensive international reach. Is this an opportunity for a second golden age? Well, there is one person who certainly suggests it. His name is Dagomar de Groot. He's an environmental historian at Georgetown, and he has written a book. Here, this is an article that he wrote for the Washington Post, and he suggests, you know, in cases of climate crisis, a lot of countries struggle, but some do very well. And back in the Little Ice Age, which happens to coincide with the Golden Age, the Dutch did very, very well. I think that's a provocative statement. I also think it's slightly problematic. I'm not comfortable with that statement. I also don't think it's really representative of the Dutch approach. I do think that it sort of haunts the international water ambition. It's sort of there, just haunting it a little bit. Okay, so this is the way I would approach it. I would say there are unconscious aspects to Dutch water policy, including the international water ambition, and to the Dutch perception of themselves as the major player in the international water management sector. These reveal themselves as symptoms. Okay, so there's something that the Dutch sort of they're not fully aware of that is perhaps repressed. I'm going to call on this gentleman for a little bit of assistance, not a lot. The first thing I want to say is, you may not know this, but Sigmund Freud was very, very interested in the Dutch. And he had his eye on the building of the Afsluitdijk. He was watching it closely. 31, 32. And he was watching it, and he used it as a metaphor for the labor of psychoanalysis. He said, land reclamation is exactly the right metaphor for what psychoanalysis does. What we do is we help shore up the ego. And that means claiming land from the id. And that's what water management does in the Netherlands, right? Here's an idea I'm going to use, though. Symptoms are derived from the repressed. So that's that stuff that you don't want to deal with, right? And it expresses itself as a symptom. We're familiar with the notion that pathology, by making things larger and coarser, can draw our attention to normal conditions which would otherwise have escaped us. If we throw a crystal to the floor, it breaks, but not into haphazard pieces. It comes apart along its lines of cleavage into fragments whose boundaries, though they were invisible, were predetermined by the crystal's structure. He's explaining why he deals with pathological subjects, right? Which people, find distasteful. But he says, that reveals something about, let's say, our normal psychic condition, and that's important. And so that may suggest that I'm going to start talking about the pathology of the Dutch, as if they were a pathological case. I want to be really precise here and say the pathology in question is not a specifically Dutch pathology. The pathology is climate change, right? It's climate change that is bringing these symptoms to light, right? Is putting the kind of stress on the Netherlands, on the Dutch approach, that makes these things apparent in a way that they perhaps weren't. The Dutch have been living in their polders for centuries, and it's been working really, really well, especially since the 53 flood and the installation of the Delta Works, right? So this is what brings symptoms to the surface. All right, now we're going to move on to the symptoms. One of the symptoms, actually mainly this one, one of the symptoms in the Dutch case is an exaggerated and imprecise sense of how much of the Netherlands is actually below sea level. I'm going to illustrate that one with a few slides here. So this is a book I really like called Water Wars. It's an older book by an American writer, and she claims 50% of the Netherlands is at or below sea level. I won't tell you how much is at or below sea level just yet. So, where did she get that number from? Well, maybe she got it from sites like this, because if we look at this site from NAP, they ought to know, right? This is Normaal Amsterdam Spijl. They say half of the Netherlands consists of polders that are below sea level. 50%. Jeff Goodall and his book is really worth recommending, especially on Miami, I think, and on Florida. He says 75% of the Netherlands is at or below sea level. That's a very high number, 75%. Imagine, 75% of the country. I asked him about this. He gave a talk at Penn and we had dinner afterwards, and he said, there are two factual errors in my book. This is one of them. Now we're back to that general consul of the Netherlands. In an interview in 2017, the general consul of the Netherlands in southern Florida, in Miami, says 80% of the Netherlands is below sea level, and actually it's 100%. That's very puzzling. All right, what is going on? Now, that was in 2017. This is from an article published in 2010. The IPCC, which is part of the UN, got into trouble. They got called on some of their numbers. The UN panel of climate experts overstated how much of the Netherlands is below sea level. And they admitted yet another flaw. A background check said the report wrongly stated 55% of the country was below sea level. And it goes on. The Netherlands, let's see, this was the problem because 55% of its territory is below sea level. It should have been 55% of the Netherlands is at risk of flooding. The question was, here you have the numbers, it's actually 26%. And 29% in addition is susceptible to river flooding or inland flooding. The IPCC said the error was widespread. It quoted a report from the Dutch Ministry of Transport saying about 60% of the country. So the symptom is, in a country, let me just go to this right here. My question, how is it possible for a nation that is known for the precision of its water defense system to the centimeter to exaggerate the percentage of the country below sea level so wildly? How's that possible? What's the explanation? My hypothesis, the wild exaggerations of the Dutch stand in affective relation, meaning it's emotion that's involved here, to just how resilient and how vulnerable they imagine themselves to be. And how resilient, but not necessarily vulnerable, they want the world to imagine them to be. So I'm thinking this is two-sided. On the one hand, they're saying, look at us, 80% of our country below sea level, no problem, look to us, we're the experts, right? On the other hand, they're also saying 75% of our country is below sea level, and they're anxious about that. There's actually a sort of anxiety connected with it. In other words, this wildly unscientific perception reveals a series of deeper truths about the existential Dutch situation. The Dutch, I call it the Dutch dilemma, the Dutch are all in, to use a poker term. Let me show you how all in they are. You see there that line across the IJsselmeer, that is the Afsluitdijk. Further south, that's where the Eastern Scheldt Barrier is. Those brown, two brown islands, it seems like, that's a province, a new province that was created in the second half of the 20th century, Flevoland, because that's polders. Those are polders that were created. And there's many, many polders there. Okay, what happens if we take away the Delta defense system? This. That's how much of the Netherlands would be underwater. And that includes the cities Amsterdam, The Hague, Delft, Rotterdam, etc., all underwater. That's how all in they are. The Dutch need large-scale prestige projects such as the Mekong Delta Plan and the Great Garuda Seawall Project in order to shore up their international reputation. It's a small country. It's 18 million people, more or less, right? It doesn't have a lot of economic clout. and it's a player in the world, right? And it's rivaling much, much larger countries. So it's tricky. So they need to maintain that prestige through these projects. So we know Jakarta is sinking, as Kimmelman told us in the New York Times, so fast it could end up underwater. And the Dutch had a solution for this. It was the Great Garuda Seawall project. Chris Silver is an expert on this. This involved, it involves many aspects of the Dutch approach. Land reclamation, which would have been available for developers to invest in. The investment would have paid for this seawall. This would have been a seawall all the way around here, which would have created, basically this is an afsluitdijk, right? So this would have created a body of fresh water here. And there would have been high-end development on all of these islands and so on, and out there. It would have been, of course, very dramatic from the sky as you come into Jakarta. There would have been light rail and a toll road and so on. Real estate is at such a premium in Jakarta because it's a city of 10, 11 million people proper and 30 million or more in the larger metropolitan area. So many things solved here, but oops, what happened here? Let's see. But large-scale international prestige projects are high risk for the Dutch because so much is out of their control. The project was scrapped. And there were many reasons. It was embroiled in religious and political controversy. There were social justice issues. There were environmental issues. There was concern because of the polluted rivers that retention bay would have been just a polluted septic pool. So many problems. But it was a solution. It was a Dutch solution. The project was scrapped. It will be replaced. I mean, they are going to build something, but it's not on the scale of the Great Garuda, and it won't resemble the Garuda, this mythical Indonesian bird, either. The survival of the Netherlands depends on successfully maintaining the myth of their mastery. I think that the Great Garuda, or the fact that it was scrapped, that it failed, this has been somewhat traumatic, I think, for the Dutch. I've sensed a kind of Garuda panic that has been a consequence of it. And wanting to avoid similar situations. But still, projects like this are very, very important. Because the Netherlands is sinking too at a subsidence rate of as much in some areas as 2.0 centimeters a year, not as much as Jakarta by a long shot, but with no end in sight. It just keeps on sinking. Here we have a recent government document in the event of extreme sea level rise, which could occur if the targets of the Paris Agreement are not met, and who thinks they will. More fundamental choices about the protection and spatial organization of our delta will be unavoidable. More fundamental choices. This underscores the importance of keeping the promises of the Paris Climate Agreement. That's a remarkable thing. They've linked, this is the first time I've seen this, they've linked Paris with water protection. And if, the Great Garuda is out of their control, Paris is totally out of their control, even though, thanks to this amazing climate lawsuit that this group Urgenda brought, the Dutch are actually moving to decarbonize at a great clip. It's quite a remarkable phenomenon. So they're all in. They're showing it can be done, it has to be done, because they realize, maybe more than most in the Western world or in the North, how important that is. Up until recently, planners of the Rijkswaterstaat relied on conservative sea level rise projections of the IPCC. No longer. This is also a brand new document, 2018. Possible consequences of accelerated sea level rise for the Delta program. So the Dutch are publishing now their results of their analysis, their reconnaissance of the situation. And they're dealing with working with projections of 2 to 3 meters by the end of the century, and trying to figure out what will we need to do. So this is an illustration that comes with it. It shows that Antarctica is very close to the Netherlands for good reason. It shows a number of interesting things. How many pumps will be needed at the Afsluitdijk? You know, what capacity will be required? Drinking water problems. How much sand will be needed in order to keep the dunes, to raise the dunes and to keep them intact? How often will the Eastern Scheldt and the Maasland need to be closed? At 1.3 meters, the Eastern Scheldt will have to be permanently closed. So it will become an Afsluitdijk. The Maasland, 30 times a year, it will close at 1.5. If it gets a little higher, that will be permanently closed as well. So those innovations that involved openness will have to close up. Right? Now, what's behind that government report is something that is called a hackathon, a policy hackathon, which took place, I think, around 2016. It was done by Deltares, which is this research institute in Delft. And the names that you see down there indicate the scientists and climatologists, engineers, et cetera, who got together. And they tried to figure out, tried to model what would the Netherlands have to do if waters would rise more quickly. This image, there's going to be a little bit of iconography going on in the next few slides. This image is really telling. 2 Dutch boys, curly blonde hair, on the beach, behind a dike that they built, and they're watching an island disappear. Right? That's an interesting image to put on this report about the hackathon. But gets even more interesting. This is at the end of the document. These are cartoons. Interesting choice. 3 options for the Netherlands if water rises much faster and at a higher level. You can see, in one case, the rivers are diked in. And so these rivers just sort of, like a raised train, like just go through the country and out. Of course, you can draw water from it into retention basins if you need that for fresh water purposes and so on. But it doesn't look like a great solution. Okay, what else? Fortress. You can see that this is a castle fortress. Enormous pumps, right? So all of these European rivers would hit the wall and have to be pumped out at ever higher levels into the sea. That's a kind of protection no one would want either, completely cutting yourself off from the sea. Third option is going back to the way the Dutch used to live 1,000 years ago, on top of elevations. Terpen is what they called them. A kind of indigenous knowledge that existed back then, almost as if we're coming full circle. But remember that map of the Netherlands. This here, those are the dunes. All of that is filled in with water. This is probably, well, this is Rotterdam. You can recognize it right here. These cities become islands on this reading. What is significant, I think, is that the Dutch are studying the situation and daring to imagine it so that they can face it, so they can draw conclusions, make recommendations. The Dutch need to succeed in the international water management market in order to be able to finance the reinforcement of their water defense system and, sooner or later, the more drastic adaptations that will be required. Retreat could be one of them. Floating cities, perhaps. This is from a group in Rotterdam called Delta Sync. This is a city that looks a lot more like New York or something like it, New Yorkish, I think. And what you see in green here would be a floating city annex, right, which might be required. And if you look closely, you'll see that in the middle of that river, there are these skyscrapers. They're in the water, right? So this is an imagination of a situation where water levels have risen considerably and where one solution may be floating. It's getting taken seriously. It probably is. It is in the Dutch toolbox. there are floating homes, floating communities. There's a floating farm that just got constructed in Rotterdam. The students of my Penn in Berlin and Rotterdam program have donated a cow, and that cow will be called Sustainability. We had a little contest. We voted between Sustainability, Rachel Cowson, and if not cow, when? All right. The Dutch dilemma, this is my final slide, is a metaphor, finally, I would say, for the dilemma of our time. It doesn't even have to be water. It could be, the IPCC report also drove home what little time we have to achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's actually quite similar. I heard 12 years a lot. But it's that kind of a time frame. We are all in. We're all a little bit Dutch, I think. I think that's one of the reasons we find the Dutch so fascinating, or I do, so instructive too. It comes back to Polder-Geist. There's a kind of mentality, a mindset. It's not mandatory, but I think it's a very instructive one. And it lets us see both a sort of hopeful, can-do side, but also, I think, through this kind of analysis, makes the anxieties that also haunt this present. They come to the surface. And so with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you very, very much. I'm looking forward to hearing from the respondents.
Thank you very much, Simon. Another very interesting talk going in the direction of the Dutch, and I feel more Dutch than I think I feel. We're going to turn, and indeed, time is of the essence in so many different respects. We have about a half an hour or so to talk, and I'm very grateful, Terry, Angela, Les, Chris, that you have been willing to join our discussion today. And what I thought we would do is basically, maybe we'll just go through, because I think it would be good for people to have an idea who you are and where you're coming from. Just say maybe just a few words about what your investment in climate issues, sustainability issues is. And then my idea is, let's just get right to it. Let's ask questions. Let's talk about what we're finding interesting in this, etc. So Chris, I'll ask you please to introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Chris Silver, a professor in urban and regional planning in the College of Design, Construction and Planning. I grew up in a Dutch city in New York, Schenectady. It still has a little Dutch quarter there, and I hang out in the summer in Castine, Maine, which also had a short Dutch occupancy. But I think the real connection is the work that I've been doing for really the past 25 years on Indonesia, and specifically Jakarta, which was the Dutch city of Batavia that was set up in 1619, and that is, as Simon and others have pointed out, the fastest sinking city in the world. They definitely have it over Venice, although when you go to Venice, you feel it every day. So.
Les Teal, I'm professor in political science. I direct the Sustainability Studies program here at the University of Florida. Just happens I was in Amsterdam last month for a conference, and we'll be in Rotterdam in April on another one on climate change issues and robust policy.
I'm Angela Lindner, currently Associate Provost for Undergraduate Affairs. In my former life as a professor in environmental engineering sciences, I was very active in sustainability research, sustainable engineering. In fact, I was hired here at UF 20 years ago to be the green engineer that then transformed to the sustainable engineer as we added legs to that stool. Today, the interest that I have is with our folks around this room, and it's in education. And how do we impress upon these next generations the sense of urgency, but not only that, the critical role that every one of our students graduating from this university will play in solving these wicked problems that can be solved if we have the will.
I'm Terry Harpold. I'm a professor of English here at UF, and I'm founder of the Imagining Climate Change Initiative, which is a about 3 or 4 years old now, we make an effort to bring into conversation humanists and artists and scientists to try to bring to bear the creative imagination and its particular talents on both the practical aspects of the crisis that face us, but also I think that, maybe I'll talk about that in a bit, but the sort of the transformative dimension of it in terms of human imagination and what that is required.
So thank you very much. I'd like now to sort of get things started, and I would just want to throw a couple of general ideas out. One is, these are a couple of things that I mentioned yesterday, which is I think the increasing need to be able to speak across disciplines. I think that this is something that many of us are increasingly persuaded by, that whether we're coming from humanities or whether we're coming from engineering or we're coming from design or wherever it might be, that we talk about these problems that affect all of us and endeavor to find some kind of language or narrative that somehow is making sense to all of us, where we feel like we're on the same page. And so organizing an event such as this hopefully is a way of beginning to do something like this, and certainly responding to certainly an exemplary sort of posture towards the problems of climate change. In the posture of the Dutch historically and presently is one way to go at that. So speaking across disciplines, communication across generations in terms of education, trying to get the word out, trying to begin building a certain kind of discourse or language that is informed by people who've studied these things and know the most about them. So that's the one thing that we talked a little bit about yesterday that I was hoping perhaps we could carry forward today. How do we start creating this sort of discussion that calls us maybe a little bit out of comfort zones that we have? I'm a medieval literary culture person who's coming a long way to the issues that we're talking about today. But so that's one thing, and then a couple of the things that we were talking about yesterday, and these were things that are continuing to come through today, and just kind of are part and parcel of these sets of problems and issues that we're dealing with, was the combined sort of this pair, urgency and agency, this kind of proximity, or the sense of the need to act and to act with some degree of urgency. There's no time to spare, but finding a kind of agency, or finding different kinds of agencies which perhaps are inspirational, that perhaps in the sense of Polder-Geist or something, leave us kind of with the sense that there is a way to go forward, there is a way to involve, there's a way to regard problems as opportunities. How do we do this? So that might be part of that narrative. So I'll stop there just kind of with those ideas and invite anybody who would like to pick up. Please, Les.
Sure, I've got some rambling comments. First, thanks, Simon, for sending all the materials you did. I really enjoyed them, and particularly in Henk Ovink found an amazing ambassador, and we'll use some of those videos for my students. On the issue of what's going on at an unconscious level for the Dutch, I'm not so sure. I mean, at one level you bring out that they're pretty straightforward about this. They call it, water ambition. And there's a sense in which it seems like it's fairly patent. The stuff about the, getting the numbers wrong, I guess, coming from a country where since the largest inauguration in all of American history, there's been something like 3,000 pants on fire lies coming from the White House. A few missed numbers from the Dutch doesn't seem like that big of a deal. And at the same time, I am kind of interested in this notion of, whoops, no, there you go. I'll take it. This notion of putting things on the couch. And this goes, thank you, this goes back to the issue of maybe some of the interdisciplinarity here. So as I was thinking about this talk and this notion of what the humanities can bring to it, it struck me that, over time, water has always been something that has been employed mythologically as that which brings us to task. And you can think of it as, the great flood in Sumerian myths or in the Abrahamic traditions, with Noah. And the story is kind of always the same. Hubris or sinfulness gets out of control, and water eventually comes back in to set things right, although after a great deal of pain. The Greeks have the same story with, of course, Icarus, who Daedalus, the great technologist, gives him wings. The sun melts the wings of Icarus, who is made out of wax and feathers. The sun melts that, and he crashes down into the ocean and drowns. And again, water is where you pay for that sort of hubris. And it struck me in thinking about it that it's not, there's this sort of the literal level of water, the flood, or the ocean drowning us as making us pay for either greed or technology getting out of control. But since you brought them up, Freud, water has always been, in the Jungian tradition, has always been that which represents the unconscious. And there's a certain sense, too, in which it's these myths are about how when our unconscious gets too large, the id gets too large, the sort of the rampant instinct, greed, lust for power, and all that gets too large, then literal water sweeps us under, and we pay that. So I think there's lots that water offers us, both literally in terms of where we can have our comeuppance when water retakes its place, but also at a sort of a metaphorical, psychotherapeutic, and in that sense, humanities-oriented level, where we go back into the mythologies around the world and look at the extent to which water has played a prominent role in revealing where we often go wrong as a species.
To stay with a little bit with the psychological analysis, I mean, if you look at Jakarta as an example, it was a waterstad, a water city that the Dutch actually created in 1619. That they're now coming back to try to come back and fix that. And there's been periods, certainly in Indonesia's emergence from a colonial period to independence, of this, the Dutch wanting to do the right thing, and then failing to do the right thing, and then being kicked out of the country, and then being brought back in to do the right thing. And it was interesting, your slide showing that how much of the investment in the waterfront city was actually coming from Dutch aid. I mean, the Dutch have been extremely generous to the Indonesians as far as that aid is concerned, especially since, again, they're now back on positive terms. And obviously the other work that they're doing in South and Southeast Asia may help to cover some of that cost. One question, though, that I did have, a more specific, how are they going to make money on technical assistance? I mean, as a sort of a global strategy. I can see the tulips and the other things that they export, but I can't see, unless they have really big construction companies and material, how do they do that? And do they know how to do that? Because it's really a government operation that's really Deltars is really, in a sense, the salaries are being paid through at least partially government support.
I'd love to hear more from all of you before I answer.
Okay.
But thank you very much, Chris, for that question.
Well, I'll continue this. I'm really thinking this through the lens of engineering training, and I call that training. When I was educated as an engineer, as a chemical engineer, environmental and civil engineer, there was a premium placed on first studying the particular, but placing no value in the particular, but rather the universal. So, for example, I'm in the chemical engineering laboratory, I'm working in a beaker level. there is no value at that beaker level. My goal is to translate that to the universal. Okay, my area of research is in water aquifers, large water bodies, working small scale, but the value is placed on the large scale in the universal. What I see in getting to Will, your 2 points that you wanted us to look at is in terms of how do we speak across disciplines, and then urgency and agency. I have come to know that the valuable role of humanists is to elevate and to body forth the importance of the particular, right? The particular human or human particularity. Engineering training provides none of that. And so one of my questions is that the technology in the Netherlands, was it designed for the particular, right? Or for all people as we call it, or the greater good? I think in watching one of Henk Ovink's videos, he mentions that a little bit about after Hurricane Sandy, and that heart is always present at the human level. But I thought it was interesting that at the end he showed a map and called it people, right, at the very large scale. So we all are prone to universalize. I believe that the invaluable role of artists and humanists, and they should be part of every interdisciplinary project. And if you notice, Henk didn't mention that humanists were part of his interdisciplinary projects. He mentioned social scientists, but I didn't see any evidence of that. And I think they're key to every one of these projects, because they do body forth what I call an as-if society. I think the Dutch are as-if people. So they imagine the impossible, and then they live it, they embody it, and then over time the impossible happens. I look at these designs, and I've gone through years of engineering training. How in the world did they do this? Did they pull this off? So the Dutch, to me, are symbolic of this as-if mentality that I think that we're all leaning towards, and that we should lean towards more, and allow them to infuse this mentality into our culture. So be as if people. Live it, even though you may not believe it.
Yeah, you took a lot of words out of what I was going to say. But I do want to talk about the classroom in a way, because so I teach classes in climate fiction and the visual imaginary of climate crisis, and I get students from all different majors. But one of the things, focusing very specifically on this at this moment, there's a lot that could be said. I could bring out my Lacanian Swiss Army knife to deal with the analysis, the clinic of hydrological regimes. But I'll leave that to one side, because I want to say something that I've been thinking is very, very important at the university, but at other universities as well, as we reinvent the university to deal with the world that's coming. Everybody needs to be at the table, because we have to have a variety of, I won't say solutions, but responses, because I'm not sure that solutions are forthcoming. I think we're talking about adapting to the world and finding new ways to adapt. Everyone needs to be at the table, and one of the ways that we get a lot of very fine, very motivated, very engaged young people who are not engineers and not physical scientists at the table is we draw them in through, let's just say more generally, the literary imaginary. We bring them in through conversations about the fundamental challenges of ethical challenges and social and cultural challenges that literature is very, very good at presenting to us, very good at challenging us to do. And we bring the engineers into the conversation, because we show them that discourse is also of value, and indeed not only enriches but can transform their own discourse. So everyone gets involved. You know, we at UF, other places, we do really, really fine work in architecture and agriculture and geological sciences, and a lot of really exciting stuff is taking place in the sustainability program that Les is involved in. We need more classes and more research opportunities and research endeavors that are focused on hydrology as an imaginary regime, as a regime of the imagination itself. because while I am deeply and very powerfully moved by the pragmatics of dry feet and of trying to keep not hold the water back, but redirect it in such a way that you have some degree of agency in response to it, I sometimes think that the most pragmatic response to a transforming world is something that is wildly impractical, is to try something radically new. And I think that one of the things that happens when we have conversations between humanists and scientists and social scientists and humanists is that we open up new avenues for reinvention of the self, reinvention of the other as well. These are engineering tasks. They have profound scale problems. Costs will be enormous. The value of them is yet to be seen in the long run. But before people could commit to such a transformation of the physical environment, they really need to transform how they think about what it means to be human and what it means to be part of a family, a clan, a nation, a world. And that is what literature and art are really good at. They're really good at provoking you and challenging you and scandalizing you to reimagine the self and the other. And so when I say everyone needs to be at the table, I think that's because not out of some sort of mutual reinforcing, ornamenting, or even a kind of facile multidisciplinary approach, but we need to be challenged by the essential differences of our discourses. We need to be provoked and troubled by them. And I know when I'm most successful in the classroom dealing with very bright, very engaged undergraduates is when their response to me is that something is really hard to think about. That when they feel, I'd never thought about that before and I'm having trouble thinking about it right now, but I know that I should try to push through to the other side of that. And that happens when we have these kinds of conversations. It's the non-intersections of our discourses that are often in the long term far more productive of meaningful work than the stuff we can already agree on. We can all agree on keeping our feet dry. I think we need that. But what we don't agree on right now is what that actually means in terms of reinventing humanity, which is, and its relationship to all the other earth beings of our world. And that's a great challenge that faces us that I don't think we're quite living up to yet.
Wow, those are very, very fine responses. Thank you to all of you for those. I'm going to take them in reverse order and just sort of see where we go with them. Inviting everybody to the table, that is the Dutch polder model, right? When they think of it in social terms. But what's tricky about that is, you may have you may think that you've invited everyone to the table, but maybe you haven't. And so Henk, I don't know if you ever listened to this, but humanities sometimes aren't invited to the table, and hopefully Henk, as well as others at the university, the academy, but also in other places, will realize that it's worth having the arts community, professors and others working in the humanities at the table for the sorts of things, the resources that they do bring to the table. The Dutch polder model says that, you come to the table not really offering something. When you come to the table, and it's the Dutch polder table, so to speak, you're actually supposed to be there and to represent your interests, right? To represent also your needs, your perspective, and it should, you have a claim to the legitimacy of that perspective and to having it heard, to having others acknowledge it, and so on. That's a really, really fine thing. I don't want to get too distracted here, but it was also one of the points on which this NGO from the Netherlands, working with an NGO in Indonesia, faulted the Great Garuda Seawall Project. Because at both ends, right, their report on social justice at the Bay, or at Bay, I think they called it, using a pun. Not everybody was at the table. The consultative practices of the Netherlands, the Dutch polder model, were not observed, and that was also a flaw, right? So that can be a flaw. I can say in Semarang, our group includes a group called Grobak Hysteria, which is an artist collective. And their role and contribution to the process has been invaluable. It's been fantastic in terms of what they imagine, but also the work that they've done in the meantime with the communities, especially in the kampongs and so on, and allowing these designers, from the Netherlands and from the U.S. Sort of to see things that they haven't seen before, and these have to be taken into account. Reinventing people. That's a daring thing to say, but that's involved, right? We won't call it engineering, but there is a kind of reinvention that will be required, in a reinvention of the way we live our lives, the way we understand ourselves. I've been tracking that a little bit, or maybe tracking is the wrong word, just wondering about it, I think is the right word. What happened in the Netherlands when, at that crucial moment, they decided, we're not going to build another Afsluitdijk, we're going to build an open storm surge barrier. Does that mean, as a consequence or as a corollary of that, did something in the the Dutch personality, let's say, did it also become porous at that moment in a way that it wasn't before? I don't think it instantly did, but there is a sort of paradigmatic shift that's occurring, right? And that does get taken up in discourse about oneself, how you explain yourself and what it is that you're doing and so on. And so I'm wondering if that porousness comes into the picture. You and I both love J.G. Ballard, and especially that novel, The Drowned World. That's a most radical sort of imagining of human society unmoored from soil. Right?
Second Adam searching for the forgotten son.
Yeah,
the last line.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary novel, but it shows the risks, I think, too, because the risks of becoming so sort of porous to commit or actually almost give yourself up to a watery regime. Which is, really unsettling. On the other hand, anthropologists, of course, help us understand the few people who still remain also in Indonesia, right? The Bajau people, I think, the people who live their lives on boats or have lived their lives on boats, and who feel sort of shaky when they get on land. That's also, an important aspect, an important element of the human experience, and one worth consulting. So it's grateful to both of you for those remarks about the role of Indonesia now, the role of the humanities, and your emphasis on the particular and the relation of the Netherlands sort of as a particular to the universal. Replicability, I think, is something that the Dutch think about a lot, right? So Henk will write this in the sort of guidelines of a call for action, that whatever it is that one does, novel as it should be replicable. Bankable, of course, but replicable as well. So it is, the particular, that has to do with the urgency of our situation, And I think here maybe, Terry, there are two timelines. Let's see, they're not exactly working against each other. Maybe at first sight they are. You said the humanities, is wildly impractical, so to speak. Is that what you used, the term you used?
I was suggesting
Yes,
that.
wildly impractical. Right. And that may seem like not exactly what one wants to hear at the point where urgent action is required. However, if one isn't exactly sure what to do, and the sort of urgent action that one undertakes is not sufficient, then maybe it is still the better way to go, to think impractically, to think outside the box, to use all of those metaphors. Okay. Chris, yes, I would love to talk so much more with you, and I hope that you can come up to Philadelphia soon, and we can, that conversation that was deferred.
We got snowed out.
Yeah, exactly, that can take place, because I would love to talk with you more about Jakarta and Indonesia. that's an issue. Money is a really a big issue. As I understand it, and I'm not a numbers kind of a guy, so I haven't looked at it all that closely, and even if I did, I'm not sure that I would quite grasp it. But I understand that dredging is really important for the Dutch. They do it really, really well. They're big players, and that's also a part of what they do, right? So dredging is like the money maker, so to speak. Figuring out how, from that sort of position that they have with all this knowledge, but not much of a sort of not much financial clout, not the sort of massive firms that China or Korea or Japan can muster. It's difficult to play on that playing field. Right. And as far as I know, this is being recorded, so I'll be cautious. I don't know this for sure, but I believe that what will be built in lieu of the Great Garuda Seawall project is sort of Dutch planning, but I think it's a Korean firm that's actually going to be involved in doing the building, right? Yeah. And that feels like, that's where the money is, right? In actually employing all of these people and building it and so on. Yeah, so that I think continues to be an issue. Henk is a very innovative man, and he's worked with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank for water as leverage, getting them involved early so that the projects that develop are bankable. Right. So it is for Henk always important that these projects be implementable. Right? And yeah, so thank you very much for your remarks about mythology. I think you're exactly right. The flood story is all over, and sometimes we might think that there's that they resemble each other. There was a lot of impetus to have it be that way, right? As we discovered Gilgamesh, or as a it actually, a lot of it had to do, was happening at the University of Pennsylvania. As these cuneiform tablets were discovered, unearthed around the turn of the century, 1900 thereabouts, there was a lot of religious concern that at first this might, be in conflict with the biblical account. And so there's a lot of pressure to make it sort of conform to or to create a narrative, a context in which it would support it. And that, I think, has prevailed sort of at least on the popular level for quite a long time. But I would insist on the specificity, particularity of these mythical accounts. They arise in a landscape, in a situation, remembering perhaps an event of some kind, and that got worked through, on a mythological level, and will tell us, there are stories that are useful for us, and I think you're not wrong that water, is often what comes back as a retributive force, punishing force when some hubristic acts have been committed. But I think that there are often more specific lessons, let's say, or things to be learned from these events. I actually have a spiel, which I won't give now, where I insist that it's important for us to forget Noah and forget the whole ark story, because the real short version of that is that it's premised on saving a few. And I just do not believe that that's an idea that we need right now, because we need to save a lot, not just a few. So that's where I am with that. The Icarus, that was great. It hadn't occurred to me. I was wondering, where are you going to get the water from? And all of a sudden it's the plunge back in. I thought you were going to mention Deucalion, which is the Greek flood myth, which is there. Then in Ovid too, there's Philemon and Baucis. They are witnesses of a flood. They live up on a promontory, and they're witnesses of a flood that Zeus brings about because of the inhospitality, or they're inhospitable, the people of the city, and that's the result. And Goethe, in Goethe's Faust, reworks that material, and in ways that bear reading now. I think they're really, really instructive. So thank you so much for your responses.
We have just a few minutes left, and a few other people want to give you all a chance also to chime in if you'd like. Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richter, for your talk. My name is Andrea. I'm a graduate student in the English department, and I really find your talks just compelling on a personal level because I grew up in Miami. I was born near South Beach, and I don't think I've ever lived 20 minutes away from the sea until I moved to Gainesville. So I have. This idea of the Polder-Geist is really interesting. Like I don't want the Poltergeist, but I want the Polder-Geist. So one thing that really I think makes me anxious is this idea that we're thinking of these imagined landscapes in the Netherlands, and it really scares me because I think of like people in Miami who are being pushed away from the sea by all of these like imagined landscapes that are in gentrification, and I'm wondering where these people are going to go, like the lower income people who've always lived in these outskirts, right? And it makes me anxious for these people, like they're going to be displaced by these really expensive places that they can't afford, and like I don't know, I just was wondering if you I'm maybe I just voiced an anxiety here, but I'm just wondering if there's anything that you think, where do you see kind of like that happening, I guess, or how do you see that kind of developing?
No, I really appreciate your anxiety and your concern. I think I can hear it in the timbre of your voice too, and it's shared by many, and I think it's a really legitimate and urgent concern. In the U.S., but ever so more in the global south, for instance, in places like Indonesia, Bangladesh, and India, and so on. It's going to be a struggle. Many people will be affected. I've seen figures that indicate that 10% of the world's population lives in coastal cities or on the coast. So that's a very significant chunk of people who will be affected. And so it is important to be thinking about it now, and you can be sure that many people are thinking about it. And there, within limits, the limits that our current sort of let's say humanity allows, or the way that humanity of the West has organized humanity allows, they're working within those limits. But I think that we have to imagine beyond those limits because it's that urgent. And we have to imagine not arcs that save a few, but rather ways to save many. And, and I think that that's really, really the important message is there's a certain Dutchness to it, to seek the opportunity that may be present in the urgency of the crisis, to look not just for brute retreat, let's say, or other sorts of displacement which are extremely disruptive, but can it be coordinated with organizing new ways of life, or organizing new senses of community, or new economies, and so on, right? The word that I hope that many of you are going to be thinking about, will also repeat, or will want to learn more about in the United States context, since this taps into an American metaphor, is the Green New Deal, right? I hope you probably have heard of it. It's one that I think we're thinking about. That's sort of our contribution. It's not the Polder model, it's the Green New Deal. And that may provide a sort of perspective of hope. More immediately, there certainly are NGOs, social justice movements in Miami and elsewhere where you can lend a hand, get involved. I think that at this time, becoming a part of a community, cultivating a community is one of the most important things you can do, and making that community be sort of an example or a preliminary example of the new kind of community we're going to need. It may draw on older traditions for sure, but it will become a sharing community, let's say, one that isn't based on let's say, on accumulating things and high-end entertainment, but actually doing constructive things and being there for each other and figuring out ways to be there for each other and for other people as well.
I want to add something to that because I think it's really, really important when you think about dealing with young people in the classroom. My experience is with the young students, and I include the graduate students, you know, but that's a message they want to hear. They know they're going to live in a world where if it is going to be a peaceable and compassionate world, they're going to have to share less with more, right? And they are very receptive to that argument and to that assertion. They're looking for how to put that into a plan of action, of course, and that's where we start getting beyond my pay grade. But I think that one of the missions that we have in the classroom is to talk to them in a way that's sympathetic to the immense impracticality, if I may go back to what I said before, of what you just said, but the utter necessity of it, because the alternative will be a very terrible world. And that's a huge imaginative task that faces us in the century, and we don't have longer than the century to solve it.
But I think the good news is that this generation coming in, and I'm even accepting you all because generations change so quickly,
Right.
but these 17, 18-year-olds coming in, what I admire the most about them is they do it anyway. And as like I was mentioned before, they truly are as if individuals. They get out there and do it anyway, even though it's so daunting. Unlike my generation, it's just not going to make a difference, right? So we have that to our advantage.
On that note.
Oh.
We are 5 minutes over. Terry Harpold, Angela Lindner, Les Teal, Chris Silver. Good friend, Simon Richter. Thank you for coming. Thank you for making this all possible.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Greg.